Mexico that is suffering some challenges, and hopefully yesterday, I wasn't here, but hopefully yesterday you did hear about some of the challenges facing the industry in Mexico. Vinte is very successful financially, and they have no problem in delivering their product. The homes typically have solar water heaters and smart meters. The owners can monitor the energy use, their water use online, and the computer is included in the purchase price. And that's actually financed, interestingly, by the banks. They had to work hard to do that, but they actually got the banks to finance these computers in the price. They also provide homeowners training in computer, how to operate a computer, because most of them haven't even seen a computer before. And once they get access to it, get comfortable to it, they can then monitor their energy use online, which is very important. Once you know what you're spending, you really pay attention to it. They also do, they do training to transition property management to the owners of the houses, because again, most of the owners just simply have never been in a formal environment before, so they have to learn that they have a community responsibility, and they transition the management responsibilities to them. They also build houses that are part of a community, and people who buy their houses feel as though they're moving to a community, not just a house. There are schools, there are parks, there are community centers, police stations, which Vinte builds and actually hands over when the community is ready for it, and they take occupation. Price, I'm sure everybody's looking at these and saying, how much do these cost? These ones are around 65,000 US dollars per unit, which is quite affordable. I want to talk now about the Mexican industry. Go back. The Mexican industry, it's all about scale, and land is a very expensive resource, which is really similar to here. It's a scarce resource, and the developers normally need to invest in land and build a land bank, but they typically don't use it for several years. So that becomes a real drag on their cash flows. And that actually plays into some of the changes in regulations that have taken place over the last few years in Mexico that have impacted the financial viability of a lot of the Mexican home builders. The Mexican sector is comprised of two segments. On the one hand, you have the formal sector, which obviously has access to financing. It has well-defined property titles. It has as I say, access to credit, and it's a very sustainable market. The other part of it is completely informal, and it's similar to what you see in Nigeria. There are no titles, no ability to get financing, and it's a very unsustainable model itself. The Mexican government set out a number of years ago to essentially eradicate the informal sector, and they're well on the way to doing that. They did it through the formation of an entity called Infonavit, which is a government-backed lender. And I'm not going to go into the details of what Infonavit actually does and how it actually works, but essentially it brings a series of subsidies to home buyers and provides them with access to financing. The subsidies can come in a number of different ways depending on where you sit within the income scale. So in other words, the lower you are on the income scale, the bigger the subsidy. And that subsidy can be cash, it can be interest rate buy-downs, it can be deferred taxes, it can be a variety of different things. And clearly at the bottom end of the scale, you get a very, very big cash deduction. How do they pay for that? Well, they paid for it up to this point by a mandatory percentage payment into Infonavit. It's like a pension plan. So essentially, if you are an Infonavit subscriber, which really is the majority of the private sector, formal private employees, you pay into this scheme. You either use that donation, that payment, as a first step in buying a home, or if you don't need it, or you're perhaps too old to even think about a home, you can actually use it as your pension contribution and withdraw it at the point of time when you retire. So it has a number of different ways. It's not as if you're paying it, and if you don't take a house, you can't use it. That's just the way it works. Infonavit, through their programs, deliver approximately 500,000 new homes per year, 500,000 new homes through the Infonavit program. There's also another program called Fovisti, and Fovisti is set up to service in the same way that Infonavit services the private sector. Fovisti services the public sector. So government employees can also benefit from this. And they deliver about 100,000 homes or mortgages per year. The market, because of the systematic way this has been set up and the early successes of the program, the market is now dominated by very large publicly traded home builders. And these home builders can deliver and do deliver individually 40,000, 50,000 new homes per year. So they are real businesses with real cash flow. The success really has been quite significant. And the approach has been, I'd say, fully institutionalized with these organizations that more or less direct the nation's housing policy. So the target for... Really? Okay. So Mexico is a big success story, but I've been told to wrap it up here and move on to the next, so I'll do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Africa and how we see Africa from IFC's standpoint. Over the past decade, sub-Saharan Africa has been a growth story. There's been 4.6% annual economic growth. It's filtering through to create a middle class that are well capable of being homeowners, and that's a great thing for anybody who's in the home building industry. We clearly know there are continent-wide issues with title, with registration, with fees, and inefficiencies that have taken place that block these processes. And they apply in different ways in different countries, but generally they apply across the continent. The developer market is one that I've been coming to Africa for 7 years, and it always struck me that there really are very few developers, and with the exception of Hakeem, of course. What I mean by developer, and I think that needs a definition. Developers are entities that incorporate everything that's needed to be able to deliver housing or any other type of real estate. So that's financing, that's equity, that's the technical capability of actually delivering it. What I've found here is there are very good construction companies. There are some not so great construction companies as well. And finance it comes through in dribbles. It doesn't really have any sustainability, it doesn't have any longevity, and it's very, very expensive. So it makes it very difficult for a true developer to be formed. So what I see now is with the demographic and economic changes that are taking place in Africa, and this does apply to Nigeria, that developers are now beginning to feel that they have a place. They can actually build their own portfolios. They can actually build a portfolio of assets that has a reasonable likelihood of an offtake. And the offtake would be, in the case of houses, sales to people who can access mortgages. And in the case of commercial properties, it's obviously the sale of their asset to an investor. So these things are beginning to come in. Private equity is beginning to knock on the door, and there's a lot of interest in Africa. So it's a really good time, I believe, for Africa. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at Nigeria. The country needs to produce about 720,000 units annually for the next 20 years to begin to solve the housing problem. The building sector, the construction sector has been growing very, very fast. It's been doing well since 2007, growing at about 12 or 13% per year, which is above the economy in general. The strong economic growth, though, hasn't really translated into any employment generation. Unemployment now runs over 20%, and 80% of the population still earns less than $60 a month. So you have this dichotomy going on here. So looking at the pros for Nigeria, Nigeria has the status of being Africa's most populous nation, the highest GDP, and growth prospects are obviously very strong, as is the rate of urbanization, which is really driving the demand for housing. But affordability has historically been a challenge. Even the rental market, recent changes have taken place in Lagos State to allow people to pay less upfront. It used to be that people paid 2 years, 3 years deposit to rent a home. Legislation doesn't permit that now. But what I see in the market is that really has been more or less ineffective. There's not much change to what I saw 5 years ago. What is important, though, is the introduction of Mortgage Refinance Company, MRC, which is the liquidity facility. And that's very similar to programs we've seen in Tanzania and in Egypt. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that evolves and improves the housing market. The cons, Nigeria is 147th out of 189 countries in the World Bank Group's ease of doing business, which is not a good thing, but it's improving. It is moving up, believe it or not. Credit statistics are very, very limited at just over 4% of the total population, which makes it very difficult for banks to grant mortgages. I think that has to improve. Costs are extremely high. 60% of the raw materials are imported, which shouldn't be the case. And another contributor is the lack of basic infrastructure, which adds as much as 30% to the total cost of development. Land has been scarce. It's also been very, very costly and difficult to service. And the result really is that developers lack the experience of developing at scale in the affordable sector and really have been focusing on the high-end housing. So to wrap things up on the last slide, there are lessons learned. There's a need for coordination of the planning process and the use of the planning policies to encourage sustainable communities. Mass-produced affordable housing lends itself to the adoption of low-cost technologies, materials that have been successfully adopted by countries such as Mexico, India, South Africa. They should be adopted here. Use local construction materials wherever possible. Microfinance can form a very important part of the overall picture, as we've seen in places like Kenya. Encourage the intervention of DFIs such as IFC and use our experience. Introduce rent to own. There isn't really much of that. Households can rent homes, which they eventually buy. They build up their credit score. Credit records should be improved. The 4%, definitely that has to be increased. And strike a balance between government-supported and funded housing programs and free market mortgages. I think you have to realize that government housing programs are not a long-term solution, and they're really there as a temporary stepping stone in the process. And in the case of Ogun State, there is one obvious advantage, its location, which right next to Lagos is undeniable, and it's a unique advantage. Thank you.